privilege to be your moderator for this panel discussion. This discussion is going to be a look back at the drafting of the first edition of the I-codes. And I couldn't be more thrilled to be up here with the staff that really, made it all possible in my mind. We're gonna let them each introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what they did, and then we'll talk maybe about some perspectives. This is going to be an unfiltered session, so it might get a little off color, because from what I understand, drafting the I-codes was it took a lot of forms, right? There were some late night activities that I think helped. We're also going to open it up later for questions and answers, because I know some of you out there may have even participated in drafting the first editions of the I-code. So from 2003 to 2000, there was a considerable effort working with the three model code organizations to get the first edition finished. And it was a historic and monumental feat. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom and then just go down the line and introduce yourselves and let the folks know a little bit about you.
Thank you. Well, my name is Tom Frost. I was the Senior Vice President of Technical Services. And I think, as I think back about this whole process, the memory that I've got is that I really doubted we'd be able to pull it off. It seemed to me that there was so much competition back in the day between the model codes and the staffs that the idea of coming together to put a single document together kind of clashed with what I've observed over the years as to how difficult it is to do code development, the care and the effort required. And to do that as a collective effort among the three model codes struck me at the time as nearly impossible. I was genuinely pleased and surprised to see, after an initial startup, how well it went. What I was concerned when we started the actual drafting process was that each group would measure success by how much of, quote, their code got in the central document. And there was some of that, and it lasted about 20 minutes. And to my amazement, people were very quickly drawn into the collectivism of this effort, the idea that the net result would be well worth the sacrifices, the compromises that would occur. And that is the overarching recollection that I have of the process.
Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Armstrong. I was, under ICC, the Vice President of Architectural and Engineering Services. That position doesn't exist any longer. However, leading into this and for our discussion today, I was actually the original drafting secretariat working with some other model code staff who looks very familiar to lots of you too, on the drafting of the original 2000 edition of the International Residential Code. Like Tom, it was a very challenging time. We all had our own, certainly, beliefs about whether or not we could pull this off. And amongst staff, we did have some competition, there's no doubt about that. But what I found, certainly with the IRC, because honestly that was our first really mixed committee of not only just building officials or governmental officials, we had government, we had the NAHB reps, and we had those that represented industry as a whole. It really was those that represented industry and NAHB and others out in the audience that really pulled this together too. There was no way that we could have done this by ourselves, honestly. It really was, like Tom said, kind of a collective effort of not just the committee, but certainly everybody involved. And so I was very happy when it was done. It took a lot of time, and certainly even our relationship with NAHB was a concern, but that worked out great too. So I'm very pleased with where we've come. Actually, I'm going to be on the IRC committee again this next spring. So please come to Orlando, and we can have some fun there too, going through the IRC code changes.
Hello, I'm Rick Okawa. This is the first time I've been back since I left ICC, so I was very surprised about being invited to come and talk about the codes and the history. And I was trying to think, what do I remember about that? So I had to go back and review some of the dates that things occurred, which it really taught me a lesson as to how quickly actually we did it. We had such a short timeline actually to get it to I think our goal of 2,000 I-codes. So we had to, first of all, in my own experience, didn't really know the other staff. One of the major things that I experienced was being on the board for the coordination of model codes, BCMC. That allowed me to meet a lot of the staff from the other model code groups, which, at the time, I thought they were all monsters, but turns out they're okay. They got to understand, I think all of us got to understand that we were all after one thing, commonality among the entire nation. And so it was important for us to keep that in mind, to try to be more singularly in thought rather than competing. And so that, to me, I always kept that in the back of my mind in the whole goal of us creating a single document across the country. So I enjoyed, after thinking back, the experience I had in doing this. It wasn't easy. Certainly wasn't easy. One of the first things that we had to do was create a common code format. That was a challenge because all of our subject matter was in different parts of each of our codes. So we had to move a lot of documents around in order for us to put this all into an acceptable document where we had some commonality, and so we could compare section across on the same subject. That was a challenge in itself. And so that was accomplished by creating a matrix of 5 columns of each of the model codes, the 3 codes, and a BCMC provisions that also had the same subject matter and a comment section. So this was a 5-column matrix to study all the various sections of the codes. That was the first challenge, and then to create then the committees. I really have to congratulate all the drafting committees that were involved. I mean, as ICC, we spent hours and hours compiling all this information for the committees, but it was the committees themselves that volunteered their time to spend hours, I'm sure hours, in looking at the provisions and trying to decide on what sections they should choose of what code and how it would all make sense at the very end. So I don't want to take up all the time, but it's. I want to talk a little bit later of the benefits, I think, of how much we've gained over this time. I'm now out of it, not in the details of the technical requirements, but I see a real benefit to the single code, single company that in hindsight, the first time I came to this, I was amazed as the amount of accomplishment we've done in such a short period of time. And a lot of it has to do, of course, with Dominic and the other parts, other leadership. So I want to just now pass it on to Mike, if I can.
Hi, Mike Pfeiffer. No, I'm not back. It's only been a year and a half. I'm staying away. I'm going to put a little bit of meat on the bones in terms of, to piggyback to what Dom said and what Rick said as far as the time frame. When it was all said and done, there was 5 drafting committees. So for those of you that weren't around, and by the way, one of the people on this dais was actually on one of the committees. Mr. Sims was on behalf of Palm Beach. He was on one of the committees, and as they all said, we had an ICBO staff guy, a BOCA, and an SBCCI staff guy. So it was that plus a 12 or a 15-person committee. As Tom indicated, it was intense in terms of how are we going to do this, because the marching orders were 2000 was the magical time frame. And so get an addition out by 2000. And that's not just the building code, that was the residential code, and that was the fire code. You know, by that time, we've already had a couple of I codes out. The plumbing code came out in 1995, the IPC, and then the mechanical and the fuel gas. I don't recall those dates, but I remember the first code that ICC published was the 95 plumbing code. So how the process worked was basically in 1996, September of 96 to March of 97, I was the secretary, one of the secretariats for fire safety. Fire safety was still the same chapters it is now. And it took 9 meetings. The goal being to create what was called, what was the phrase we used? The working draft. So in a span of about 8 months, we created a working draft. So that became the starting point. And like that's already been covered, the matrices was the way to do it. And some of the sacred cows, you know, hey, wait a minute, Boca didn't have fire districts, Uniform Building Code didn't have fire districts, but SBCCI had fire districts. And there was a line in the sand that was put down, because it was an appendix back in the day in the standard code, and that was the Fire Safety Committee. And the line in the sand was, as a minimum, fire districts need to stay at least in the appendix, at least through the first edition. Then if somebody wanted to pull it out through the normal process, that way, again, you had that transition. You wanted to get, the goal was, it's along the same lines as, you know, one of our favorites, which is height and area, right? Height and area. How do you create height and area from 3 different codes? Well, a lot of it had to do with potentially, as Rick indicated, the BCMC. Because BCMC had a table, but that was one way of doing it. But all the committees agreed when it came to that, because let's face it, you know, that's the gospel when you get down to the code. And all the committees basically said, the philosophy would be, if I could construct it under BOCA of a type, whatever the type of construction it happened to be, under SBCCI or under UBC, you better be able to do that same thing under the IBC, because otherwise people will go into sticker shock. So we created a working draft. That was done in 97. We put it out for public comments, had a forum in Denver. That resulted in a first draft, and that was in November of 97. Had a hearing on comments in Alexandria. Then the work really started. We created a final draft. The final draft was posted and published in July of 1998. We had a code development hearing in Costa Mesa in March of 1999. I'm going to ask by a show of hands, who here was in Costa Mesa for that? Damn, there's a lot of old people here. You remember how many code changes we had in Costa Mesa? It was actually a little north of $4,000. It was 40. If you included part 2s, it was 4,500 code changes. And the breakup was in the building code, we had 1,772 code changes. So in other words, I guess what that meant was the drafting kind of worked, but it wasn't perfect, because wait a minute, I'm a BOCA guy. I want the BOCA provision in there. I don't want that. I don't want the thing from standard. I want, you know, et cetera. But when it was all said and done, we lived through Costa Mesa, and then we had our first joint meeting, final action hearing in September of 1999, which resulted in the publication of the 3 new codes, building, fire, and residential, in March of 2020. So that kind of gives you the portrait in terms of what did it take. So for all intents and purposes, we started in the fall of 96, and we put out a code in the March of 2020. So that's kind of the what?
2000.
Did I say 2020?
Yes, Mike.
You get retired, you forget these things. I'm sorry. But yeah, a 2000 edition. So, and I'll go back over to Don, but I wanted to give you a bit of a framework so you understand what we all went through as staff, and more importantly, what the committees had to go through in terms of trying to get stuff done. We worked hard, long nights in meetings. We also played a little hard too. And maybe we'll talk about that a little later.
Mike, my daughter's in the audience. Please.
Okay, we won't talk about that. Back at you, Dom.
Well, you know, one thing I would like to, there's someone who's who you all worked closely with back then, who isn't here, Mr. Rick Vognold.
Yep.
Tell me, what role did Rick play in all the drafting activities?
I met Rick at BCMC, and he was a very nice person, very on the more quiet side, but very effective in everything he said. So people listened to him when he spoke. He had very good points to make. He was one of those people that I thought really could compromise on various things that he thought were rational and logical. So he was kind of the solutions guy to try to, okay, this is what we can do to resolve this issue. And so I really had a lot of respect for Rick. I was sorry to hear him go. Really a great guy, and I miss him, but wonderful person.
He was silent. He was a silent leader. He best say led by example, but you're exactly right. He was kind of like, he was the elder statesman in terms of that. And I'm sure he was given marching orders from Bill, Mr. Tangy, again, get this thing done, but, let's all play nice in the sandbox, because, there was code officials on these committees, and as well as staff, who they had a lot of pride in their respective model code. I mean, they've been doing it for some of them for decades, and so sometimes you had to navigate that in some cases, and sometimes it was pretty easy. You just couldn't come in and say, well, this is the way we're going to do it. You had to, and I like the phrase that Rick just used. There was compromises. Yeah. Let's get this in there. Let's get the first edition done, and then let's watch the codes evolve through the codes process.
Yeah, Rick was very well connected also, and like has been said, he was quiet, but as Rick indicated, when he spoke up, he had something to say, and he was well supported in whatever it was he said. And he also did his homework. I thought he had a great sense of priority in terms of what was important, certainly to really focus on between the 3, or in the case of the IRC, we actually had 4 codes to work from. He did a great job. Honestly, I have that feeling about a lot of our staff that was involved at that time too.
Well, I always enjoyed that in any kind of confrontation, Rick would insist that he represented the voice of the South. A strong point.
A strong point. Talk about how did the work get divided up? I know there was for a while there was a bit of tension between what goes in the building code and what goes in the fire code, and how did those issues get resolved?
The biggest issue was the building versus the fire,
Yeah.
and it had to do with the fire protection. In terms of, okay, which code, Boca, where do you have it? Do you have it in the fire code? Was yours fire prevention, which is obviously not sprinklers because again it's retroactively after the fact. And I got to be honest with you, I don't recall if maybe that was done by the steering committee because there was a steering committee made up of representatives from each of the 5 drafting committees. But my recollection was the big nut there was the relationship of the building code and the fire code, because you had the Boca National, you had the standard, then you had the uniform fire code, and they all had a bit of a different philosophy. So then the question is, where best to place these requirements in terms of for ongoing maintenance going forward?
Right. There was another issue along those lines. ICBO territories did not have a residential code. We had the Uniform Building Code. And then ICBO staff would produce ancillary documents that would talk about residential types of provisions and try and specify those. But we did not have a residential code. So we went into certainly the drafting of the IRC with having very little experience with the CABO 1 and 2 family dwelling code. And Dick Kuchnicki was here. I was so happy to see him because he was the director of the Council of American Building Officials. I have to get that one right because we have CALBO here also. But going into that, it certainly was decided pretty quickly on that we use the old CABO 1 and 2 family dwelling code as the format because we didn't have a common code format at the time. And then we decided to put alpha designations in front of the section numbers, and that was an unbelievable amount of work to do, just to go through every single section and add an R or an E or whatever. Right. It took a lot of time to do that, but that was another one that it had to be kind of figured out as well.
And it had a benefit with the IRC because you had a starting point. It started with the CABO 1 and 2 family dwelling code,
Exactly.
the 98 version of that code. Unlike building fire, basically it was the proverbial clean sheet of paper.
Yeah, yeah.
Rick, you mentioned format, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit, all of you, on some of those challenges, because you don't think about things like that as much today with technology. A few keystrokes, you could change things, or with AI, you could, but we're early in the technology era, right?
Right.
It's still, I would think there would have been a lot of work there. My other question would be, tell us about the mays and the shalls. Was there any conflict there?
Shall be permitted to versus may.
Right.
Yes, the permissive language issue was a biggie. It's hard to even describe some of that, and we have a friend who was assigned that, as I recall, and she's unfortunately not able to be here. But yes, we had to go through and decide whether or not exceptions would have an allowance that would say you may do something versus shall be permitted to, which is much more mandatory language.
Yeah, I don't know how much I have to say about that. Well, let me go back to those days were not electronically astute as we are today. Let me say that. I mean, I use an old BlackBerry phone, if you know what that is. I don't know, maybe you don't. But a lot of things in my mind, had to be done manually. We were able to create the matrices in the Common Code format, but a surprising amount of staff time had to go into creating these comparisons. And it was very time-consuming, and when looking back, I'm amazed that we were able to get it done in the amount of hours that we had to do it. So I'm very grateful to our staff who were very dedicated. I think they saw the goal in mind and understood it, and that includes all the model code staffs. Because at that point, I think we're all cooperating to get this thing done so that the committees can have enough time to review the documents and to be able to respond intelligently on what they had studied. So.
And on the technology side, I actually grabbed a 1999 version of what was effectively became CP28. And back then, now where do you get your code book? It's online. It's on CDP Access. It's online. Well, back in the initial stages, when you submitted a code change, you had to submit 12 copies of the code change. Okay, and then, oh wait, but how do you get? Where's the book at? At least in Boca land, you would send in a coupon, and we would send you a code change book that was about the size of a phone book. That then advanced to where we would have a CD in the pocket of the code change book. Now we're fancy. Now it's CDP Access and everything's online. But back then, it was WordPerfect and everything. So Rick is exactly right as far as the extra time it took to do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Just because we didn't have the technology back then.
Yeah. Yeah. There was another couple of aspects too. I've had probably too much caffeine. Like,
You always have too much
but
caffeine.
in leading up to the drafting of the I-codes, we also had, as was mentioned, BCMC, Board for the Coordination of Model Codes, which produced reports, not only heights and areas, but all sorts of things, stages and platforms, among others. And so there was also a push to, at least to start, to coordinate our own respective codes by bringing those reports into our respective code development processes and then running those through the system. So I remember certainly spending a lot of time trying to bring in the three-part definition of means of egress into what is now Chapter 10. It was Chapter 33 back in the day. And that was a boatload of work, I mean, certainly for staff, but again, the committees, the people in attendance really had a huge impact on being able to get all of that done. And then there was one other thing. I'm trying to cut it to real short. We had to metricate the codes.
Oh.
Oh, I heard that groan. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Right.
We thought that was going to be easy.
Yeah.
And certainly we had to decide on the protocol, what we're going to do. We're going to put everything in millimeters or centimeters or, the square of or whatever. And then we had to provide a metric equivalent of equations.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the constants in there didn't have units, but the units were built in, and we had to try and figure all that out. So there was a lot of stuff going on back in those days, certainly leading up to the I-codes.
Forgot about that.
So much fun.
Well, maybe we should open it up to the audience for questions. See if anyone has any memories or any questions about for our panel. There's a microphone up front, if you don't mind.
Don't touch the microphone. I think that's what Bill Bryant was saying. Okay.
Memories. I was on the Fire Code Development Committee, and there were actually initially four code groups on the fire code. One dropped out. We won't name that one, but that happened for a little while. But we met all over the country. That's a memory I have of it. We got to meet a lot of different fire departments. I'm from Uniform Code City, Austin, but it was a lot of fun. It's one of my greatest memories of being a part of this organization was spending that time going from fire departments in Seattle all the way to Tampa, Florida, and every place almost in between. It was a lot of fun. Probably one of the highlights of my career.
Thank you.
Hello, Marcel. How are you?
Hi, fine, thanks. How are you, Mike?
Good.
Hey, I just wanted to comment on Paul brought up non-mandatory language. That's been the bane of my career for the last 20 years. Every single ASTM standard is written in may and should, and I've been spending the last 20 years getting rid of the mays and shoulds and getting arrows into my head, into everywhere else. Sarah was the one she was at Boca. She was at Boca, and she kept telling us that we would never accept anything if they had a may and should, so you're going to have to change your STM standards. Thank you for that.
Sarah we called her, she was the queen of permissive language. That was
The May Queen, indeed.
non-permissive
Back then it was Sarah Buens, before then she became Sarah Rice. and now she's Sarah Collins.
Yes.
Thank you very much, all of you. I'd like to hear a little bit about what led up to 1996. How did you
Okay.
get the motivation to do anything?
I'll get the ball rolling. Well, basically, you obviously you had the three different model codes, right? You had Boca. Boca predominantly was,
Keep the mic.
Midwest and towards the northern. Oh, I'm sorry. I got the ham. I'm not even Italian. So you got Boca that was basically in the Midwest going towards the Northeast. Southern, the SBCCI was down, Kentucky down into Florida. And basically, uniform code was basically west of the river, basically Mississippi. So you got these three model code groups, and they all basically had similar but different processes for updating their codes. Some of the things were pretty similar, but some things they did them totally different. And Rick, I'm glad you brought that up. He brought up the Common Code format. The Common Code format was a huge deal. Put yourself in terms of a structural engineer. I'm not going to acknowledge an architect, so I'll just acknowledge structural engineers for right now.
You're the Lone Ranger, man.
But that was in 1991 at the behest of, it was the three model code groups, AIA and SFPE, under the auspices of CABO, the CABO 1 and 2 family dwelling, CABO organization. They said, wait a minute. If I'm an architect or I'm an engineer or I'm a contractor and I'm doing something in Tennessee, where do I find the same provision if I'm doing that same thing in Wyoming? Well, the Common Code format, coupled with BCMC, was kind of a step in that right direction. So it had its challenges, but there was a coalition back in the day. I think it was called the Get It Together Coalition, back in the early 90s. And that was one of the organizations that was really keen, along with the foresight of the three CEOs, Paul Heilstad, John Traw, and Bill Tangy. They recognized the need, said, wait a minute, we got these three things, do the math. That's a lot of duplication of efforts there when you think about it, and not to mention the fact that you're doing it somewhat of a disservice because you got three different sets of requirements. Why do we try to standardize it? So that's kind of where it started, was that, again, clearly the three CEOs were integral to that whole process, but early 90s, and then obviously a start was the CABO 1 and 2 family dwelling code. And for those of you that remember Model Energy Code, there was a yellow book called the Model Energy Code. It was just a little pamphlet. It's not like the energy code of nowadays. So there's always been those three separate entities or the different codes, but it became pretty clear to become more efficient for the groups, not necessarily to have a merger yet. That didn't happen until 2003, but to at least get on the same page. And then obviously that started with the IPC in 1995, and then from there, and again, before that, CABO 1 and 2 family, which could be adopted especially for the West Coast where they didn't have that. So that's kind of the history in terms of how we got from the model codes through the Common Code format into the drafting, ultimately producing the 2000 edition of the I-codes.
Well, going back even further, one of the things that was happening is that architects were designing all over the United States. And every region they would go in, they would have to use a different code. So that became a real problem for them as well as for the actual construction industry. So there was a position paper written by the AIA to come up to some level of a singular document of a model code. And that's how the conversation, I think, got started. At that time, we had a president by the name of Bob Fowler, an architect, who was listening to all of this and started to make sense to him. Why not have a single document that could be used from coast to coast, the East Coast to the West Coast? And so that, again, translated to the CEOs of each organization, Paul Heilstad, John Traw, and eventually Bill Tangy. So once they were on board, then the boards had to get on board. And I don't think it took much because I think they all understood the rationale to come to a single code document. And that's my recollection. I think even with all the effort that we had to put in, not only the staffs of each organization, but also the committees that were assigned to study all the different documents, I think it was well worth the effort. I think we're seeing the fruition of it through our conferences.
Rick, do you recall the role that the plumbing code played in initiating all of this? I seem to recall that that was actually the first document that generated the discussion of let's produce a singular code among the 3 model codes. I wasn't working in code development at that time, so I don't have any direct knowledge of that, but that was the impression I'm left with.
My recollection isn't all that great either, but the plumbing code was one of the first international codes to be published. And some of it became a problem, at least for ICBO, because of IAPMO, the organization that published their plumbing code. But we eventually got into agreement with IAPMO to jointly produce the document, and so I think that was resolved. But no, you're correct, the plumbing code was the first document. I don't remember actually all the nuances of how that whole process began, but that's where it started, I think, the whole discussion of that whole effort.
Oh, good. So I didn't imagine that.
Yeah, John.
Yes, John. Oh, there he is. Let's hear from the expert on the plumbing code, John.
My recollection is pretty darn good. And John LaTorra, at the time I was the building official for the city of Redwood City, and Bob Fowler appointed me as ICBO's rep to work with Bob Konendijk, who was BOCA's rep, and Carol McLemore, who was SBCCI's rep. March 29th and 30th of 1994, the 3 of us met at Country Club Hills, and we started drafting the Joint Model Plumbing Code. Our assignment was to combine and look at the codes from the 3 legacy groups. Each one of us knew that there were more codes in the country. We wanted to create the best plumbing code that we could for our country. So we took it upon ourselves to look at the 7 major plumbing codes at the time. We looked at LA, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Dallas. And in a month and a half, if you can believe this, we prepared a draft of the Joint Model Plumbing Code. It was available May 16th of 1994. Then we decided to expand our committee, adding 2 additional BOCA reps, Bud Lester and Judd Collins. And then we added 2 ICBO reps, Bob Storkheim and Bob Croft. And we decided to have public hearings in Fairfax, Virginia, and Reno, Nevada. They were supposed to be 2 days each, but the Reno, Nevada one dragged on for 3 days because we had tremendous feedback. And as a result of that, then we published a second draft. And then we had to convince the members of BOCA and BOCA and ICBO to accept this draft, which they did in September. SBCCI was participating as an assistant to ICBO. Bill Tangy wanted to get the membership of SBCCI on board first, rather than producing a document for them. And it was interesting. So the 2 organizations accepted it, and then the 3 had to sit around and decide, well, who's going to publish it? Because we each had separate publishing software. well, let's create a new organization, kind of following along the CABO lines. Let's create a new organization. And we applied in November, and that organization was finally approved as a California corporation. That organization is called the International Code Council. And we decided to change the name from Joint Model Plumbing Code to International Plumbing Code. And then we had to decide on the format, and we had to decide on the color of the cover. We had been using some new modern technology called a fax machine. We met every 2 weeks in Chicago, but we had a ton of homework, and we were sending faxes back and forth. Fax, 8.5 by 11. So we ended up deciding to produce an 8.5 by 11 document, which was significant because at the time, there were no model codes in the country that were 8.5 by 11 format. Guess what? Today, every single model code in the country is 8.5 by 11 format. And then we had to decide on the color of the cover. And it could not be tan, could not be brown, could not be blue, could not be red, because those were the colors of the existing model codes. It was decided to be green. So the other thing that I want to point out is really Bob Fowler that started this effort. And he convinced the presidents of the other two organizations, which then filtered down to the staff. It was Bob that led it. And I'm pleased. Bob and I wrote an article in July of 1994 to explain this process, which I just turned over to ICC. And then Bob followed up with another article, taking a jab at my college degree, which is aeronautics. Bob wrote an article in 1996 to explain our progress. And that article talks about the desire to build a model code format and one set of codes for the country. And the gist of the article is aeronautical engineers have determined that bumblebees can't fly. You know, it's impossible. And on the other hand, people in the country are saying that there's no way you can produce a model code for the country. Well, guess what? Bumblebees can fly, so it makes sense that we can produce model codes for the country. So I also want to let you know that that group of 3 that expanded to 7 really led the way, including we developed the administrative section that each one of you used. And we kind of were flying under the radar. In a month and a half, we were able to develop a draft document and get it approved and published in January of 1995. And I think it led the way and saved a little bit of time by the time we got to what people think are the big issues, which is building, residential, and fire. So you need to thank Bob Fowler, and you need to thank that group of 3 that became 7, and then we also need to thank these people that are here, and I know there's several people in here that participated. So thank you for letting me to ramble, but I'm so proud.
And thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you,
for
John.
your hard work and your years of participation. It's an incredible story. We very much appreciate that.
I just turned over to ICC staff my first draft that I had the foresight to have all the people participating sign it. It's the only one. So hopefully it'll be preserved.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Mike Boso from City of Grove City, Ohio, and Vice President of ICC. So we all know we landed at the international codes, but what other names were considered? And how did you come up with the name?
Oh, that's a good question.
The only thing that I've ever heard along those lines, Mike, was there was a commonality in a couple of them with the word international,
Yes.
because it was actually called Boca International, SBCCI, so international. So they all had international. That's the only thing that I recall was that commonality of the three MCGs.
Well, there was consideration of referring to it as the national code, but at that particular point, Boca had acquired the rights to that term, and the consensus was no, we can't use any of the names associated with a specific model code. So even though that probably would have made sense, that was discarded, and international became the go-to title.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you remember the economic and political movement at the time was opening up world trade, and I think the CEOs at that time were very much, especially John, very much interested in making sure that someday in the future that these codes could be used international, and I think that was very visionary.
Yeah. I have to say, however, that right after we published those and going out and doing training in some of these other countries, they were a little bit taken back. Some people thought that we were stepping too far out in front, that we were trying to impose our codes internationally. That really wasn't the case. It's a name.
And it went the other way, where some domestic jurisdictions said, what the hell's going on? We don't need no international codes here.
Indeed.
In 1999, I left the Codes Department, our ICBL Codes Department, and later renamed Technical Services. But I wanted to start that international effort, so I created the International Services. And with some heat from various sources as to why are we doing that. And so it's been a growing lesson for me over the years in trying to talk to people about the importance of our global effort. And I'm glad to see, based upon what has occurred up to this point, the amount of collaboration that we're doing in other countries, as well as obtaining countries that are accepting our codes and adapting their codes for their own country. I, for one, believe in that model, that old model. It's probably not used today, but it said, people helping people build a better world. And so, in my effort to talk to other countries, and we had so many visitors from other countries coming to us to understand what our system was. And so we did the same thing when they asked us to come to their country to talk to them as to how that whole effort was being developed. I know we're getting off the subject as to how international was started, but the truth is, as John had mentioned, that international was in all of our individual model code names. But then he, in fact, had a great desire for us to become bigger than we are. That there was enough information here that was so important that we can share this information. You know, one of the things, I was invited some time ago to Abu Dhabi, and as part of that conference, they invited people from England as well as from Germany, and they were after deciding on what code to use in Abu Dhabi. In that discussion, the British standards talked about their document, Germany talked about their German standards, and then I gave a presentation on our codes, our family of codes. And at the end, I told them, I said, it's more important that you not decide just on what code you want to use in your country. All of our codes are good. You don't see a lot of buildings falling apart in each of our countries. So I don't think that's the real issue. The real issue here is establishing a complete system. And I think in the US, we have the most complete system of any country that I've been to. And I think that was the main selling point, is to how do you support the code? How do you verify that the people that are inspecting the code are certified? How do you inspect how do you determine whether the products they're using are accredited? How do you provide the kind of training that's necessary to establish your building enforcement personnel? So I emphasized the completeness of our regulations. And in our system here in the United States, we do not get federal funding. That's a big benefit for us worldwide. Because if we were a part of the federal government, how would it be for us to go to a country that maybe there are some political issues and try to convey to them how our buildings would help them build in a certain way, would withstand years and years of duress? So, in my mind, we have the greatest opportunity here at ICC to grow our corporation worldwide. And I think I'd like to see that effort, and I'll be in favor of it.
Well said, Rick. Ron?
I am Ron Peaster. Back during my New York Department of State days, one of the most important initiatives that the Code Council undertook was the development of the IEBC, which came after the first publication in 2000. It was really important to the state, and I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about what drove the development of that document, the philosophy of the IEBC, and then maybe hear a little bit about the challenges that we faced actually integrating the IEBC into the family after it was first published.
Before y'all jump on that one, I got one more thing about the
Point of order, is that what you're saying?
No.
Oh, just checking.
Just one more comment relative to why international. Bill Tangy, in his conversation, said, we don't want to call it the U.S. Building Code. And he was thinking along the lines that all of you talked about in terms of its international application. So when you start thinking about that, if it was the U.S. code, other countries would look at it differently than as an international code.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, good point, Henry. Okay.
I was involved in the IEBC in terms of the development, but that doesn't mean I'm any kind of expert. We got people who teach it around here.
Well,
a lot more involved than I ever was. But
well, we did have a predecessor, a legacy code.
Right.
Certainly, ICBO had the Uniform Code for Building Conservation.
Right.
Didn't say existing buildings, which was the interesting thing in the title, but it had a lot to do with existing buildings. And then BOCA had certainly your criteria.
We had criteria.
And it was a challenge, as I recall. I wasn't directly involved with the IEBC because the IRC was kind of time-consuming, to say the least, even afterwards. But
I want to say, too, that his code, I think New Jersey, the rehab code was,
I think that
was also one of the, for lack of a better word, one of the resource documents potentially in order to produce the existing building code.
Yeah,
The existing building code, for me, this may be sacrilegious, but it's always been a misnomer because it's really not an existing building code. An existing building code, when you think of it, it means that's an existing building, I gotta go fix it, like it's a retroactive. An existing building code only gets triggered when you're doing some work, right?
Exactly.
So it's not a retrofit code. It's not going to fix a problem with an existing building. It's just going to allow you to make alterations, repairs, and everything else under the cover, change of occupancy, et cetera. But my recollection was it was a significant challenge along the lines of doing the other. Mr. Terry's laughing over there. So I guess it was, yes. It was indeed a challenge.
yeah, it was. We also had the International Property Maintenance Code, going to what you were speaking to, as well, and that was a challenge. And then we had another one. Are there any planners in the room? I have to ask. Raise your hand. Don't be afraid. Uh-oh. I see you. Thank you. Okay, just so you know, we have, even now, an international zoning code. And we had to bring that in because ICBO had created the Uniform Zoning Code. And The funny thing about that one is that we had a very extensive sign set of criteria when you're dealing with wall signs, monument signs, all that. And we did that our way with using governmental officials to develop it. However, the International Sign Association took offense at that, shall we say, and they rattled their sabers, and we went and we did a lot of work with them too. So there are a number of documents that, while they're published and all that, they did have kind of an interesting history. I even had to fly to Orlando to meet with the International Sign Association board of some sort, and at that point met a Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah, and we talked about all things related to sign ordinances and the regulations of signs, and got them involved in the process then, which has been a great thing, and they modified the sign ordinance to make it something more palatable, I think.
Good story, Paul. Well, let's do this with a few minutes left. Let's do final thoughts. Most memorable moment or meeting in this whole ICC iCode development process in your mind? What's one thing that sticks out the most to you?
I'm gonna go and piggyback off of what Tom said out of the box. The most memorable was when the light bulb went on for the committees to realize it don't have to be the Boca requirements, just because I'm from Boca. When that light bulb went on, it's like, it was a hell of a hurdle, because then they realized when it's all said and done, okay, there's got a different requirement, I'm not used to it, I'm gonna learn it, great. But they actually took the mindset, you had Boca guys saying, you know what? Standard code's got a better situation, they do it better than us, the words are better, whatever it happens to be. So for me, that was the biggest thing for me, was when they realized they had a job to do, and it had nothing to do with their own views of the individual codes, what would be the best for the new code. And I thought that was the most significant issue in my mind.
Yeah, to illustrate that, I can recall very specifically Jerry George from ICBO embracing a mixed-use requirement that was, at that point, contained in Boca, but not ICBO.
Well, of course, if it was in Boca, he would have picked that one. That would have made sense.
No, you're missing the amazing part of this.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I had to do that. I spent some time with Boca.
But to see somebody from one of the other model codes early on actually become an advocate for a provision not in their code, but because they thought it was a viable approach, really told me this was turning around.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually have a couple. One is a fun one, going back to Mike's after hours thing. But the first one was in Phoenix, and it was the first meeting of the IRC drafting committee, and we had certainly our governmental officials, we had our general, if you will, interest or industry group, and then we had the home builders as well. And Ron Burton was there, who I miss dearly. Jim Seeley, of course, another one who has since passed on. Again, a dear friend. But we went into that particular meeting, and I was very, very nervous about how we would work together or not. And it was during that meeting, as the meeting went on, that all of a sudden the group coalesced into more of a single unit as opposed to three groups. And it actually became a little scary because again, going back to the faxes and all that, we used to fax jokes to each other. And Andy Catano, who was with the home builders at that time, would collect them, and we had binders upon binders of bad puns, all kinds of jokes for that. It was great, and that committee, with the exception, obviously, of the two that had passed, but we became very close friends. Actually, Mike was part of that too, he knows. The other one, and I think Mike may have been involved with this, was after the hours in Vegas, and Ron Burton was driving a van, and we were going around and picking up, he knows, going around and dropping off, picking up people in various spots. And Ron, being Ron, didn't like to wait in the big porte-cocheres there in I think it was the Hilton. And so a lane opened up, he pulled to the left, followed around, and went into the valet parking lot when the actual gate came down, broke the gate, broke it completely off, And then all of a sudden we're stuck inside this valet lot, and everybody in the car is just busting up. And so we go over to where the valets have the little clicker to let people out, and took off once that gate was opened, never to return, thinking we were on video. But those were classic
I
memories.
remember seeing a piece of that gate show up at a hearing one time, right?
Yes, I think Frank Thompson, I think it was Frank, that actually brought a piece of that gate, or maybe a broken one, and offered it to Ron. It was a classic moment. Just those things that are burned into my psyche.
Ron's favorite cocktail, chartreuse, may have had something to do with that as well.
Well, yes, again, going to the after hours. And it was part of the team building bonding experience.
Taking one for the team.
Indeed.
Well, I want to thank all of you very, very much. Let's hear a round of applause for our panel up here. And certainly recognize your amazing contributions to the success of the Code Council. We wouldn't be here today without your hard work, your dedication, and thank you for sharing the history of the development of the ICC model codes. Thank you, gentlemen.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Hearings are scheduled to begin in about 15 minutes, but 3 o'clock. I've been corrected. 3 o'clock. We'll be back then. Thank you.